Welcome back. I hope you're kind of excited about getting to work with GUIs um, because this is where things start to feel like, oh, I recognize this as being some way that people actually interact with computers, um, much more than having to sit and type at a command line or something. Uh, Just keep in mind that there are many different types of programs. There's a lot of server-side programs that don't have any interface at all to speak of. It's just computers talking to other computers and passing files and objects back and forth. But this starts to ground you closer to that human-computer interaction, that presentation tier side of things, and that is a term that I've used now several times this lecture that I don't know that I've fully defined. So let me just take a brief moment as we move towards talking about layout managers to introduce the concept of N-tier architecture. So I'm over here at Wikipedia, which is a perfectly fine resource for topics of this nature. And so when I mention an N-tier architecture, another thing to think about that is possibly a multi-tier architecture or even a multi-layered architecture. The idea is that we want to have different parts of our application that are responsible for different jobs. And so it's really related to cohesion and coupling. So all of this stuff is tied together. Mostly, I just want to show it to you by way of a diagram. So three-tier architecture is fairly common. The presentation tier is the user interface, and it's responsible for being responsive to the user and for generating events that will then be handled by lower level tiers. The logic tier, often called the business logic or the application tier, this receives the input from the interface and then fires off the tasks that are related to the processing of the data. Now, the lower tier in a three-tier architecture is the data tier. This would be where the data is actually stored. It could be flat files that are written to and read from, but more often it's a relational database or maybe a NoSQL database, or there's this whole subset of data management and information processing which is focused just on the reliability and availability of data and the replication of data across multiple sites for either regulation compliance, but also for disaster mitigation. And but there's like this wonderful richness and many opportunities that exist for jobs at each of these tiers. So just to keep that in mind, that you could become a database professional and never write any user interface code and have a wildly successful and fulfilling career if you discover that that's if the management and optimization of database queries is something which doesn't sound like fun but is actually fascinating. As a former database administrator, I can tell you that there was some real the phrase I'm going to use actually comes out of game development. Fiero. It's actually Italian. It's that oh yes, aha! You kind of lift your arms up. I can't believe I solved that. That moment of just success that feels so embodied that you have to lift your arms up and just be feel grateful for it. I've had those moments being a database administrator. I've also had those moments as a bike racer where it's like, I can't believe I just did that. That's amazing. So like you can get these moments, and I'm sure you've had them too. And if you haven't, I hope that you do get those because there are these things that kind of add to the richness of the experience of what you've chosen as your profession. And it seems weird that, talking about like either an Oracle or MySQL or a MariaDB database could do that, but it can, as can, completing a particularly difficult project for a client or for a professor. Back to N-tier architecture. Okay. This presentation tier is responsible for displaying our information, and we want to make sure that doesn't get too closely embedded with our logic tier. So with that in mind, let's move back and talk about layout managers. Layout managers are responsible for controlling how your widgets are displayed on screen. And there are several layout managers that are declared inside of Auth and Swing, which is the flow layout, the border layout, the grid layout, the box layout, and the grid bag layout. I think they ran out of names, so they just had to start, sticking things together. So anything that's a container can have a layout associated with it, and then it's up to the layout to dictate what happens inside the container. Now, I'm going to do something that I know I'm going to regret, which is I'm going to move my application window down. So when I'm giving these presentations, I'm actually working inside of PowerPoint, but not doing a full screen PowerPoint. I'm just capturing the part of my screen that's important. I want to do this to demonstrate the layout manager to you. And I think, you know what? I'm going to move this back to where it's full screen. And I'm going to make a new PowerPoint window. That's even smarter. Oh, that's so much better than potentially having to resize everything to fit. Okay. You're like, what in the world? Where's he going with this? I'm going to look at the tool ribbon up here. And I want you to pay attention to what happens as I begin to make the window smaller. So this window is wider than can fit. But let me try to get my entire interface inside of here. And already elements inside the ribbon have started to disappear. What's happening is the layout manager is saying what can and can't be displayed. So let me make this window larger, and all of a sudden new options appear. I make it larger still, and more options appear. So as I begin to shrink the window, the layout manager is turning things that were previously multiple options into pop-out menus. Well, the layout manager plus the back-end code, and it's actually like, okay, it's really not that. It has to swap out. There's a lot of stuff. It's not just the layout manager. But what's happening is the layout manager is firing events that say, oh, wait a second, now I can't show everything. So as I go narrower and narrower, okay, all of a sudden, this wide area is being told, you know what, you're going to have to pop down underneath this menu. And as I come narrower and narrower, eventually, like these have all collapsed down to their smallest sizes that Windows is willing to show them. So now I'm getting this horizontal scroll to be able to see the rest of the ribbon. So there's this communication that's happening as a result of a window resize event, where the layout manager is also saying, okay, well, we're going to put something else in, and if it fits, if we can make the space, then I'm going to we can allow for that to be into our layout. So there's like some really interesting creative coding, and I mean, who in their right mind is going to work with PowerPoint in a window that narrow? But the thing is, the interface still has to be available, and all of these tasks need to be there. They're just hidden behind one additional mouse click. So the reason we had those things at the top of the image viewer and the bottom of the image viewer is that we did have a layout manager in place. Many of the small sample projects are just experimenting with what happens when we add different layout managers. So if we have a flow layout, for instance, everything fits across this window because it's wide, but if the window becomes narrower, then these items need to drop down and flow into the next space beneath it. So you don't have total control, but you have recommendations on how the object should respond. The border layout is set up where we divide the we slice the pane horizontally first, so we get north and south. Then we take the middle of the pane and slice it vertically, so we get west and east. And then there's also center. And we can specify that content needs to go in one of these 5 regions. If I come back over here to, this is image viewer 3, and this is the main image viewer class. It's a fairly long class, but I think that we're using, yeah. So down here in make frame, we have a border layout that's set up, and then we specify that things are either going to be in the center or to the north or to the south. So there's our file name, and there is our status. And then on the west, that left-hand area, we have a button layout. So it sets up a toolbar container, puts the buttons inside of the toolbar. Notice we have our Lambda syntax here. Make the button, add the action listener, add that to the toolbar, and then add that into our flow object. And I just want to come back up here, all the way back up here. I honestly don't know where flow is defined. Very interesting. Let me see if I can quickly find that. Oh, it doesn't. There it is. Tools. Find flow. So the toolbar, it was right above, I should have looked. Okay, add the toolbar into the panel with flow layout for spacing. So the J panel has a flow layout by default, and there's a flow layout inside of the border layout. So that's interesting. I'm curious now if I were to take this image object, let's go ahead and compile, make the new image viewer. If this is a flow layout, oh, but because it's a border layout, the border is defining this. And I don't think, yeah, it's not going to expand anything. There's no room for it to go. So there's a flow layout inside of the border west, but there's nothing about like this panel's not resizable, so we can't get the larger to flow next to it. So, layouts become suggestions, and objects need to have layouts, and there are default layouts, and they won't always be realized. Grid layout is just what you would expect. It is a grid of objects, and set up in such a way that it will expand to fill its space. And the box layout doesn't resize anything, it's just a box. And then grid box is a box with a grid. It doesn't give you a lot of flexibility. Okay, I'm sure that those of you who are, application presentation layer design oriented are saying to yourself, like, how can I make things look more interesting? You need a different tool set. And that's, I think, largely why JavaFX was created, and that's why HTML5 becomes the preferred presentation layer. Because as flexible as this is, in terms of being able to run on many different types of windowing systems, modern computer interface design has moved beyond what the basics are because of the power of n-tier architecture and being able to put different things as the front end and still hook into things that can be done on the receiving side. So one more cross, instead of presentation layer, I want to look at Google presentation layer. It's Google Slides. No. Goodness, what's the name of their tool? Give me just a moment. I'm going to find it and come right back. It took me a while to come up with a set of keywords that would give me what I wanted. So if you're looking at job postings, you might see people saying that you need to know Node.js, or you might need to know React, or you might need to know Angular. And there's this new technology from Google called Flutter. So these are frameworks that have been designed by different companies. Angular, if I were to go and look at Angular, developed by Google, is a platform for building mobile and desktop web applications. And what they mean by that is applications that are presented via the web browser. So the presentation layer is HTML5. If I come back and we look at Flutter, Flutter SDK is a presentation layer tool that's been designed by the engineers at Google. And it's a user interface toolkit, and it's used to make mobile apps or web apps or desktop apps. So again, kind of the holy grail for software development is to write once and run in many locations. And so the idea is it's not necessarily easy, and there's not one solution. If you notice down here, coming from another platform, if you're used to developing for iOS, here's your starter your starter to translate. Coming from Android, if you're used to just building on the web, if you're coming from React, which is Facebook's framework, React Native, or if you're coming from Xamarin, which is another presentation layer toolkit. And so, that's all of this stuff is very different from this. I'm just going to jump back for a second. Try Flutter in your browser. I didn't mean to install the SDK. I didn't know that was active. Spinning Flutter. Fibonacci. How about Fibonacci? Import package Flutter. Okay, there it goes. What does it look like? And I don't know that it's actually doing anything. Well, that's interesting. But it looks like they're trying to give us the option to experiment with this inside of our web browser, which is nifty. I am doing the impatient user thing where it is like click, click, click. How about spinning Flutter? Oh, it actually generated a Fibonacci list. Look at that. Spinning Flutter. Let's run that. Click me. Click. And it spins. So the this is what we kind of expect to happen in modern UI design. We expect unexpected. We expect unexpected. That's kind of contradictory. But these moments of surprise and joy when the interface responds to us, and hopefully doesn't cause us to have to wait and wait and wait and wait and wait for any kind of output. So that kind of, you do something and you get an immediate visual response while the code is catching up and actually doing the work behind the scenes. And that is much different than clicking on one of these. So, if there's a reason why we don't go into depth in UI, it's because first of all, there's an entire major here at Raritan Valley taught by Steve Caruso on human-computer interaction and interface design. So the IDMX major, interaction design and multimedia. So that's part of what happens in that course sequence. It's not to say that this stuff isn't useful though, because at the end of the day, there still has to be an event handler that either causes that thing to spin or causes something to happen when you click on one of these buttons. Because we have these layout containers, it's usually not just a single layout container. It's usually a layout container inside of a layout container inside of a layout container. And knowing how to nest them is part of the process. So, we had those different containers that I, as I was dragging things narrower inside of PowerPoint, where the developers at Microsoft were like, okay, we need to swap this container out and we need to put this in its place, and we need to, start to make certain pieces not available. And but if we're working with nested containers inside of Java, it's probably better to have each container with its own layout manager than using just the default of a grid bag layout. So last but not least, when we're dealing with layouts, these objects are going to want to slam up against to each other. So we need components that can't be seen to keep them separated. So if we have the box class, we can create components which are either horizontal or vertical struts. And we can also create horizontal and vertical glue. So struts are used to push things apart and glue is used to fill up space. And that can also necessitate creating a lot more objects, but can give you control over tweaking the way the interface is supposed to look. This section of the lecture's run a little bit long, so I'm going to wrap this part for right now. When we come back, we just need to look at popping up information to the user through dialog boxes and responding to those events. And then it's going to be time for you to start to work on manipulating images and showing me some wonderful pixel manipulation code. Okay, I'll see you in the next segment.